I was in the doctoral program at Columbia University, and in the field of education and history. And I had been, in a sense, recruited. I had been a graduate student at Harvard and took a course with a wonderful teacher and researcher named Larry Kremen, who later became president of Teachers College. And he was a crackerjack historian and was in the process of writing the history of progressive education. And he liked the questions I was asking in the course at Harvard that he was teaching. So after class one day, he said, "I'd like you to come and work with me at Columbia." And I said, "Well, you know, I'm set here and all of that and so on, and you know, I'd have to apply for scholarships and all." He said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of all of that." And he did, and the idea of coming to Columbia appealed to me, and so I did. And but part of the process of, not process really, but what I was going through and involved with at the time was the civil rights movement in Boston. In, I would say, not a major way, but I became part of the Congress of Racial Equality. And by the time I moved to New York, I was operating basically as a field operative, building new chapters of CORE. And since I was at Columbia, and Columbia had no CORE, and obviously had a lot of students who were energetic and really wanting to become more involved in the civil rights movement, I saw an opportunity there. And so I became a member of the Graduate Student Council at Columbia, and a very active one. And what I did was as part of my organizing ability and training, we needed an issue to organize around that was Columbia University based. And so I did an analysis of a number of things and found that a major issue at Columbia, as it was in many urban universities, was student housing. And what the university did is they solicited from the neighborhood, surrounding neighborhood, from people who were willing to rent rooms, and to landlords who were willing to rent apartments. And so there was a actual registry, an office of off-campus housing at the university, staffed by the university administration. And so I began examining them more closely. And the way we did it was that we would send in people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds and couples and non-couples looking for the same kind of housing, and we would compare their experiences. And this was in the days before computers, so the files were all on 3x5 cards. You'd go in and ask for something, and the person would go through the 3x5 cards, and then either say something or imply something that, well, I'm afraid this landlord really doesn't like Filipino students, and so on. And so they would do a screening on behalf of the landlord so that they would not be sending people in who would be rejected, okay? In their view, of course, they were not only providing a service, they were avoiding a social incident and so on, and keeping things calm. From my point of view, I saw this as racial discrimination and the way the university had bent itself to reinforce that discrimination. So we tested it, and we found that there was a clear pattern of discrimination. And then the question is what to do about it. So as part of CORE, there were two other universities where similar efforts were going on, focused on off-campus housing. Syracuse University and the University of Chicago. Syracuse University was headed by someone who would later become very active in ACORN and was a full professor of chemistry at Syracuse, which was unusual. And his name was George Wiley. And his daughter, Myra Wiley, was a recent candidate for mayor in New York City and is often on MSNBC and so on. And George was just an exceptional person. And the director at Chicago was somebody whose name you might remember, but he was recently a candidate for President of the United States on the progressive side and is still very active and is a current senator from Vermont. Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders was doing what I was doing in New York at Columbia and Chicago and the University of Chicago. So then we try to create a strategy of how we would bring all this out. And Jim Farmer, who was the head of CORE, contributed to the thought that so much of what was being publicized in the civil rights community, and rightfully so, was the work in the South and the work around voting and voter participation and so on. A central issue, very important, but not nearly as important in the North. Our issues were much more focused on economic issues and jobs. And if you recall looking at the signs of the March on Washington, which I also participated in, the sign said, "We're marching for jobs and freedom." It was very, very prominent and was not picked up sufficiently by the media at the time, which is a whole other side story about how they could cover it. So Farmer said that, well, what he could do is do a presentation in New York, but for a national press community, that racism was not just in the South, it was in the North. The issues were somewhat different and so on, and special, but no less important. And so he drew a press crowd and gave his talk, and part of the talk was these issues, the switches were very important, and there were issues in education, which we knew about, obviously about de facto discrimination and the separation of the races in schools, public schools, but also in higher education. And he let it hang there until he took questions afterwards. And and the press was largely a New York-based press. So I said, well, what are the examples of higher education? And he said, we have examples of discrimination, open discrimination in higher education, and at least 3 of our major institutions. And I said, where? And he said, well, Syracuse and Chicago and New York. And they said, well, New York, where in New York? Columbia University. He said, Columbia University. And so they went after him and said, how can we get more information? And he said, well, don't ask me. We have a person at Columbia, one of our organizers, Stan Salett, and you call him. And of course, the administration immediately said, we don't do that, that's not us, that's, but we had the evidence. We didn't bring it out right away. We leaked it out, again, through the Spectator, and by now, the New York Times was covering this. And they denied it, And finally, at the end of all this, because our evidence was so strong, 2 members of the administration had to resign. And no one had ever done that at the university on any issue. And my salary was all paid for and all of that. And so I moved to the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, headed by Bobby Kennedy. And that's where my major Kennedy involvement and the President's Committee began. And Kennedy was able to lead a very compartmentalized work life and so on. But my relationship with him was very good, very informal. And people would ask me later, well, how did that happen, come about? And my response was, I could speak Boston. And so the common response to my response was, oh, you meant you could speak, you parked your car in Harvard Yard. I said, no. Speaking Boston, in my terms and Bobby Kennedy's terms, was you never let the other person finish a sentence without asking a question. And so we had our conversational mode and so on. And the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency had an education staff made up of mainly older people. I was in my 20s, mid-20s by then. And they basically put me in charge of these experienced people from the Office of Education who had very little experience in the outside world or organizing or any of that. And so typically whenever Bobby Kennedy traveled and it involved an education issue, I was asked to come along. And that was quite an experience in and of itself. And at that session, after the session, Bobby Kennedy, wherever we went, he was always attracting attention and so on. And so there was a group of young African-American kids, high school kids, maybe some bit older than that clustered around him and started asking him questions. And I, together with other staff, we held back on the periphery. But I noticed that there was one kid who didn't join the circle around Bobby Kennedy, and he was off, maybe at that time sitting on a curb, but just by himself. And somehow he caught Kennedy's eye when he was doing all this interchange. And then he broke up to me, he said, well, I have to move on, and the group dispersed. And rather than going with us, Bobby went to this one kid and just started to talk to him. And the two went off a little bit, and then the both of them sat on the curb, and they just talked. And I don't think anybody at that point filmed it. Nobody reported on it. But it just gave us all insight about who Bobby Kennedy really was.